So, thanks again for the attendance. I am a futurist. It's a fascinating time to be a futurist. It was even before the current crisis, given the pace of change, and I'll get into some of that. But as mentioned, if you have questions, I would ask that you submit them via chat so that we can actually look at the questions as we go. And then they can ask me at the end of this session. We're also going to be using a polling feature as we go because it's been very insightful for me to actually hear from you in terms of what you're thinking. So look for the polls. Please participate in the polls, and we'll actually share the responses as we go. And we'll start with the first poll, Maureen, if you can pull that up. And what we want to do is gauge your thinking regarding the pandemic now before getting started.
Oh, and also, if I can, sorry, Frank, I neglected to mention, just FYI for everyone, this session will be recorded, so other people can view it later. So I just wanted to make everybody aware of that too.
Yeah, thanks for remembering.
Sure.
Just about 10 more seconds to respond. Okay.
So what do we got?
Yep. All right, looks like everybody's responded. I'm going to close the poll and share the results.
Yeah, good percentage of folks thinks it will change the course of history. Okay, when I'm done with this, we're going to bring this poll back up and ask you again. So a mental model of what we just looked at. So I always start my presentations with a walk through history because I'm finding the more I look at it, the more impactful its meaning towards this emerging future is. If we look at history, the last 3 centuries have been really all about human development. We've seen more progress in the context of human development in those 3 centuries than any time before it. And one of the most impactful periods during that 3 century period was the Second Industrial Revolution. It really spanned 1870 to 1970. That 100-year period has been called by many a special century because so much happened during that period to elevate our standard of living. And you can see from this visual, which represents the innovations and events of that 100-year period mapped around the edges to our areas of well-being. So we can see just how much occurred and where the world was before all this. If you think about no running water, no indoor plumbing, no heating, none of that. I mean, life was hard. And so there are some that believe that what occurred in that 100 years and the catalysts that were required to make it happen will never happen again. Think world wars, think Great Depression. They all served as catalysts, as bad as they were. So put that in the back of your mind for now. But along that path, it wasn't all happy times. There were periods of misery. And what I wanted to do, I just find this slide fascinating because if I look back to the 1920s, take a look at those things that were happening back then in the context of how we thought, the cultural wars that were happening, a major financial crisis right before the Great Depression. And then if we look at the 2020 period, how much of that seems to resonate today? So the question is history repeating itself? And if we think about the 25-year period that followed 1920, that thought in and of itself is scary. If we are indeed kind of replicating some of the things that happened in that time period. So although we look back at that period for all of the gains that society has gotten, there were some not so good periods there as well. And this visual, and sorry for the eye test, but I tried to capture all the things that were happening over this period, at least at some level. And you can see they're categorized across a number of different domains, from science and technology to politics to business and economy. And obviously, as you start to look at that 1920 period forward, a lot was going on. And it was the convergence across all these domains that enabled that wheel, if you will. And just to kind of harp on that notion of similarities to today, if I look at some of the activities, inventions, events that were happening back then, again, you just see a lot of similarity between a rapid pace of invention, between the feelings about immigration, et cetera, trade wars that were happening back then. Again, it fascinates me. So just something to think about. pre-pandemic, things that were occurring that look like a period in the past that had outcomes, and those outcomes were not very beneficial. So the question, as I look at this past, that I ask myself as a futurist is, what are the inventions, events, activities, things that are likely to shape the future in front of us? And this time it's likely to be on a much accelerated timeline. I don't envision 100 years passing before we see something similar, and I'll get into that as we go. But it's an open question because we obviously don't know, and that question gets more complex if we think about the impact of the current pandemic. But we do know that catalysts were required in the past to create that convergence to enable the progress, right? So you start to ask questions around what are the catalysts of the future? Is this pandemic in and of itself a catalyst? And we'll touch on some of those things as we go. But we do know that the convergence of science and technology itself is a catalyst. And it was already happening. It didn't need other catalysts to make it happen. And it really is the explosion of advancements across this curve that is creating the world that we're embarking on. And I use a curve because I really thought it was a great representation of going off into the future in ways that we can't see and predict. And so what I'll do is build towards a visual that I use to talk about this emerging future, and the foundation of it is a science and technology foundation with digital obviously at its core. So foundationally, digital is extremely important, as we all know, because it really is the backbone for these innovation accelerators that are emerging. So some of these we know of. Some of them have already been very impactful. Some of them are on the verge of being impactful, and some, who knows, may fizzle out. But they're there, and they're quickly followed by a series of other innovations that will build on that foundation. And again, we can't tell which of these play out to an extreme, which of these never really meet the outcomes that we think, but they're there. And much like the ones that follow, God, is just too much to think about as far as where this is all heading. And so as futurists, these are the kinds of things that are being tracked at some level. And it's no surprise then that people in the roles that this audience is in find themselves overwhelmed at times. And so what I like to do as I walk through these sessions is to focus on a couple, because obviously we can't do justice to all of this, but I wanted to pick some of the ones that are really relevant to the pandemic. And so vertical farming would be a great example, because as we know, our food supply has been impacted by the pandemic, and we're seeing an increase in food prices as a result. But interestingly, the supply chains themselves have been at the heart of the problem. And so if we localized farming and really brought the food to the cities in which vertical farming does, then we're likely to solve that problem. And so the question becomes, do we accelerate the path? It was already well on its way because of concerns about the future food supply. Really fascinating when we think about what is likely to happen on the food front. And really the genesis of this comes from more a concern over the population growth and what it's going to take to feed society in the next 20, 30 years. But it obviously has a role today. The second one I'll focus on is virtual reality. And I always use this even before our current situation because it really has a multifaceted impact on society. It has a short-term impact. And again, thinking about mobility of the future, there has always been this concern that virtually being anywhere drops our need to travel and fly. And so if you're an airline CEO, and I've actually had these conversations, you're concerned about where this might lead. And obviously now maybe a fear of flying or traveling in the future, given the current circumstances, might accelerate the path here. But maybe more importantly is the profound long-term impacts of where we might go with virtual realities. So if we think about that scenario, the complete blurring of the physical and virtual boundaries, the world that emerges in the late 2020s, given his projection, is a very different world. And again, if you could be anywhere in the world virtually, do you ever have to leave your house? And so some profound implications, both short-term and long-term regarding virtual reality. But maybe the more impactful piece of this visual is the second curve. Spawned by that first curve, it is a series of future scenarios that are emerging and enabled by the advancements of science and technology that individually impact our world, but collectively transform it. And so again, in the interest of time, I couldn't possibly go through all these. And if you see something here that you have a question about, be sure to ask it in the Q&A. But I will focus on a couple. First and foremost, smart cities, coming back to this one because the question around urbanization and how rapidly it was expected that the world would urbanize in the next 20 years. Now the question that's being asked is, do we think twice about that because of the density of cities, the concerns about that density in light of things like pandemics, and maybe the feeling that this isn't the last time we're going to see this. And if it does lead to urbanization, what does it do to urban planning? What types of impact does it have on the progression of smart cities? So is it an obstacle to smart cities? On the other hand, because revenues at the city level are severely impacted, does the productivity gains that one could generate through a smart city agenda accelerate our path towards that smart city? So in all of these, the obstacle accelerant discussion is happening, and it's interesting to see where this all plays out. The other one that has been a dominant conversation, no matter where I go, is the autonomous vehicle. I'm seeing a lot of discussion now that it's likely to slow down because of what's occurred. But there are aspects of autonomy when it comes to vehicles that aren't all about the car. So we were already on our way towards that last mile scenario being enabled autonomously. And clearly we're seeing an explosion in online delivery ordering. So I would expect that scenario to play out very, very aggressively. A lot of capital being thrown at the advancements of delivery. And then Institution 2.0, when I first defined it, spoke to the notion that our institutions, our structures were built for different times. So if we think about the manufacturing era, even the era before that, that's where most of our institutions were born. And already the feeling that they've outlived their usefulness, they can't really deal with the world that's emerging, was there. Now we have to think about the social contract, the impact of that social contract that this current pandemic is having, the levels of debt that are emerging in response to the pandemic and what that might mean going forward. It could be an acceleration to a new set of institutions that help us manage the path forward. On the other hand, because global cooperation is required in constructing these new institutions, and we know how difficult it is for us to do anything on a global scale, we might see chaos versus a reforming of these institutions. Hard to say, but history is somewhat of an indicator there. And then at the top, near the top of the curve, is this feeling that we were well on our way towards an automated society. Many believe that by 2030, we will have automated just about anything that can be automated. And then there's concerns, obviously, about this societal impact of that automation. And does this all accelerate the path? But first, there's also these societal factors to be considered. So if those two curves are enough to think about, they're both influencing where society is heading, and where society is heading is influencing the path of those two curves. So it's an interesting dynamic at play in this model. But as we look at this visual, there's an awful lot to think about societally, from things like there being a fall in the working age population. The visual says all it needs to say in terms of what's happening there. But in that drop, we know that we're going to have less revenues to help with an aging population. We're going to have less workers to do the work, but if we automate, that might not be a problem. But in and of itself, it serves as an accelerant for automation. And so there's a lot of belief here that this specific societal factor drives a more aggressive level of automation. Combine that with an aging population and a decline in fertility rates. So if we look at that top graph, first time in history we've had less 5-year-olds than 65-year-olds. And we're very close to dropping past the replacement rate as far as global fertility is concerned. And so less children, more elderly, less workers. You put it all together and you can almost see a roadmap to where this might all lead. Of course, disease, which I focus on these days because obviously what's going on. But then one that is probably obviously to leaders in any organization is this 5 generations of workers in the workforce, first time in history that that's actually occurred. And it creates some sort of challenge when you have that many different thought processes and individuals within an organization. And who knows, with the pandemic, does an elderly workforce stay in the workforce longer because of impacts to retirement funds, et cetera? All open questions. But the challenges of those workers is acute. Collectively, built towards a visual that represents this emerging future of ours. And if we look at it, it represents a series of dots that are connecting in ways that are difficult to predict, if not impossible. Underscores the need to view things at the system level, because individual piece parts tell us nothing. And so system thinking, as far as leadership traits go, is a strong one. We really need system thinkers as we look at all the things that have to be considered in the face of this emerging world of ours. And now, if it wasn't complex enough, we have the implications of the virus. So the question in the conversation to date has been what part is obstacle, what part is accelerant, and how does it impact the kinds of things that we're looking at here in this visual. So some examples would be, I talked about the virtual reality world, really of mixed reality when you think augmented as well. Is the pandemic likely to accelerate the path towards virtual worlds because of a need to do so, whether it's travel or other? How about the smart home? Now, if we're also working in our homes, then we have other purposes for the homes. And so does the smart home evolve to a home that can support both? A context-aware home that knows when we're in a work mode versus when we're in an entertainment mode. And so just an interesting thought about how the smart home itself might change, how it might accelerate. Next generation education, I've been long talking and thinking about our education and learning paradigms being flawed in the context of where the world is and where it's heading. And so really looking for the education paradigm to shift dramatically. And lo and behold, this virus has shifted us more aggressively towards digital learning, not with all great outcomes. I'm seeing a lot of things about it not being as effective as people would hope. But the bottom line is that's not going anywhere as far as the need for us to really get towards the next generation of education and digital and virtual learning and gaming and all the things that really support learning are critical. But more importantly, fundamentally rethinking what it means to learn, dumping information into anyone's brain in a world full of information seems a bit flawed to me. And so what does the education and learning paradigm in the future look like? And what's the intent and the outcomes we're looking for? And then we talked about automated society. The question becomes, are we accelerating the path to that society? And then obviously, what does it mean for work? A big question mark now. The future of work was already a hot topic. It just got hotter with the recent events. So what I want to do next, and we're going to go back to the use of polling as we go through this, is an exercise that focuses partly on the implications of the pandemic and then partly on the kinds of responses that might occur. And again, these aren't predictions because I don't think anybody can successfully predict these days. But if we look at just the implication side, and overwhelmingly it spans all kinds of domains, and this is just a selection of potential implications around these specific domains. And again, the responses will look very similar to this. But what I wanted to do is touch on a couple different implications and then get your thoughts on those, starting with, will the lack of comfort being in closed spaces impact services like restaurants and sporting events, movie theaters, concerts, the kinds of things that we're also very accustomed to? But will they be impacted by us being afraid to be in closed spaces? And let's get your thoughts via this first poll, Maureen.
Just about 10 more seconds to respond, please. Okay, I'm going to close the poll.
So in the responses we've gotten in the past, that really disrupted one is higher than I've seen in other audiences. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So the next one talks to energy and the discussion going on now whether the current situation slows down the path to renewable energies because the capital, the subsidies, state subsidies are shrinking, or does it accelerate the path given the situation with oil and gas? And people have been on both sides of that argument, so there's no clear answer yet. But an example of an implication, right? It can have a positive impact on our green economy. It can have a negative impact. The next one is the one I've been talking about, and that is similar to the Great Recession. Many of the jobs that were lost never came back. There were other ways organizations found to get those jobs done. Big feeling that we will do the same this time with an acceleration toward automation, and some high percentage of jobs that have been lost don't return. So let's get that poll up and see what you think.
Just about 10 more seconds. Okay. I'm going to end the poll. And here's the results.
Wow. Okay. Positive outlook. Okay, we can move on. And then this one speaks to the surveillance state, if you will, and the feeling that although there's been pushback with privacy concerns and other around surveillance, contact tracing and other need for surveillance, given the current situation, is going to accelerate the path. China has been on this path for quite some time. Does the rest of the world follow? For good reason, at least initially. And so let's pull up that poll and see what you think.
Just 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the polling.
That one not so positive. Okay, great. Great insights. Thank you. We'll keep going. So as I mentioned, the second piece of the exercise is how does the world respond across the same domains, all kinds of paths that we can take. And again, this is all conjecture at this point, speculation, because it's hard to predict. But we can come up with scenarios. We can try to think through possible paths, because we have to if we're going to be positioned to act and react. So some examples here. Big topic around supply chains. We've been all about efficiency in our supply chains. We've paid for it in the lack of resilience because of the current situation. And so many believe that we will trade efficiency for resilience, because the redundancies required to avoid the situations that have happened currently are going to drive us there. So let's pull up that poll.
Okay, just a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the polling.
Okay, terrific. Okay, we can close that one. Okay, next up, the feeling that our uneasiness with contact will accelerate the path towards different forms of interacting, and it will be contactless. And so think about biometrics, and if you're familiar with Clear in the airports, the movement of using Clear to get into our buildings, and just avoiding the need to interact at all. And so an acceleration, again, towards something that was a little bit further off in the future, but now might be closer to our line of sight as a result of all this. And then there's this notion of work. What happens to the way we work, to work itself as a result of all this? So there's a number of connecting dots here too. We can think about it in isolation, and here's a great example of just thinking about work doesn't help us. We have to think about work and its implications across a number of different domains. So in this example, you can see some of the implications and impacts across things like cities and real estate, even our homes and society in general. And so just a couple of examples would be, as I mentioned before, the reversal of urbanization, all kinds of things to consider at the city level. The real estate footprint is likely to shrink, both in the context of retail and in offices, if we don't really require the same level of office space that we do today, given the remote work phenomena, and if that holds. And an interesting one, we were already facing, at least here in the US, immigration backlash that was happening in Europe as well. If that continues or accelerates in light of this pandemic, and the notion that we have plenty of immigrants doing some very essential jobs today, Does the lack of those workers accelerate the path to automation? So clearly we can see something as simple as not simple, but the category of work has implications across many domains. And the journey that organizations were on or will be on to facilitate work of the future look something like this, and I believe it accelerates. From the connectivity required to enable work, which if you think about this current pandemic, 5G rollouts are likely to accelerate because of the increased reliance on the internet. That's just one example. So if we look at this, work anywhere as opposed to just thinking remote working is likely to uptick at some level. Hard to predict exactly how much, but it will. And the connectivity issues that go with that will be acute. We will start to finally see the automation that should have been happening years ago to achieve productivity gains that are real, could be realized by the path of technology and science, but have not been tapped into. I think this accelerates our path there. Hybrid workspaces are likely to be the future. So we will work from home. There will be some reason to be in offices. Those offices probably look a little different. I think the open footprints might be a thing of the past. Who knows? I mean, cubes might be the next big thing again. All these things are possible. And then in terms of resilience and adaptability, which by the way, I believe is the end game for any organization, things like not requiring buildings anymore. You get very asset light at some point when all that capital intensive stuff goes away. And so really, organizations are on a journey. It's not a linear journey. It could be entered at any point on this journey, but through this connected to automated to experiential path, we land in a place of resilience and adaptability. And given how fast the world is changing, given all those dots I showed earlier, we can't possibly predict any of these things that are coming on an accelerated scale, but we can position ourselves to shift rapidly when they do occur. And that's why resilience and adaptability is the end game here. And so if we think about the attributes of organizations, these are the attributes that I've been talking about for close to 7-8 years now. Because again, looking forward and seeing the kinds of the world that we would live in the 2020s, organizations that can exhibit these attributes are likely to succeed. And so it's really foundational, if you will. And so with that, I wanted to circle back to the poll question that we asked early on. So if you would pull that up, Maureen. And I wanted to just get your sense after, that quick walk into the future, your thoughts on that same question.
Just a few more seconds to respond. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll.
So I can't remember the first one, but I think it's higher. The forever changed the course of history. Maureen, do you remember?
I would agree, yes.
Okay, and that was the same effect. So we did something very similar for a C-level audience, a large C-level audience in Europe, and the same impact, the effect, higher by the end of the session than before. And it just really underscores the need to really think about these things in a holistic manner so we can start to see the potential implications, because this future that many have been thinking about years off, even before this pandemic, was not as far off as people thought. And so just the way to think about the future has changed considerably. So good to see the impact there. All right, so with that, I am done. We can open it up for questions. Thanks for participating in those polls. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Frank, so much. I think, everyone, this is Greg again. And looking at I know we had some chats come up while the presentation was going on. I think that Larry, looks like you had a question. Did you want to ask the question of Frank?
Sure. Thank you, Frank. The great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Hopefully everyone else did as well. My question is that vertical farming example, the video, where was that? Do you know?
Oh, you know what? I'm not sure where. It's in the U.S., but I'm not sure exactly which city it was in. But that's the point. It can be anywhere.
Right.
People taking buildings and repurposing the buildings to become vertical farms, et cetera. Not sure exactly where that one was, though.
I know there's a few of them downtown Philadelphia right now that are growing, in no pun intended, and turning old warehouses into growing facilities. These facilities that are may or may not be in desirable areas, and then they're turning them into grow houses.
Yep. Now, if again, the dots that connect, if we think about the localization of food production, and then you think about the supply chains that today move that food, logistics and distribution, warehousing, et cetera, there's a significant impact to all of that when you can relocalize food production. If you could 3D print anything locally, again, think of the implications to logistics and transport, et cetera, et cetera. So as you start to kind of look at these scenarios, the tentacles that they have and everything that they touch, it's fascinating and overwhelming at the same time.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I see Lalit Panda. Lalit, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, Frank. Very nice presentation. Thank you for your insights. I had a couple of questions, more on the geostrategic impact of the changes that we are seeing. One is the technologies that you've described. Will it lead to a separation between what are currently rich nations and the underdeveloped nations, especially in Africa and other places? And the second is, there is a realignment going on with China and the US and the rest of the rich countries. Do you see that financially and economically, the rich nations will have serious societal financing issues that might prevent some of these, future scenarios from happening? I mean, can we afford it?
So great questions, both of those. In terms of the haves and have-nots, as far as the Africas of the world, there's a view that they'll leapfrog, much like they have with cell phones versus landlines. They'll leapfrog to places where we are quickly because the technology allows them to. The VC funding is happening to enable some of that. There's a view that they won't be left out like they have in the past because of the enablement that technology sciences will drive. So that's a perspective. Who knows if that's exactly how it plays out. The China and the financial phenomena is really just fascinating. One, there's a lot of concern, obviously, that China is rapidly innovating. And anybody asks me the questions around societal unrest and the U.S. or Europe and other countries slowing the path down, because that's potentially a path. We can say society can't absorb all this. We need to slow it down, like privacy concerns and legislation, et cetera. But if China can still accelerate their path forward, and they have a government approach that enables that, short of unrest that undermines it all, that likely leads them to a place faster than the US and Europe can get to. And so does competitive disadvantage for the US and Europe have them rethink their positioning? In other words, we can't worry about societal absorption. We have to keep pace with these nations that are now blasting in front of us. And historically, this is how it's gone every time. You look at history, this scenario played out over and over again. And society be damned, we have to keep moving forward. So history tells us something. Financially, though, it's interesting because there's a lot going on in terms of debt and our perspective on debt, because the follow-on inflation hasn't happened. I mean, never happened after the Great Recession, hasn't happened to date. We're seeing food prices go up, so it's an interesting to keep an eye on. But if after this pandemic, inflation doesn't follow all this money we've thrown at the problem, then debt is not going to be a concern. And you're going to see people not worry about throwing money at this innovation. So keep an eye on it, because I have no idea where it goes, but it's an interesting space to keep an eye on.
Fantastic. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Lalit. Chris Shull, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Greg. So looking at the news over the past couple of days,
We have to.
I'm sorry. I'm just wondering if there are any, science and technology innovations that you see as being particularly useful in helping us improve societal fairness and justice, and if anything, I'm hearing a lot of the automation stuff I feel is more likely to negatively impact minorities and women who have been disproportionately discriminated against over the years.
So the innovation that helps us with those problems aren't science and technology innovations, as far as I'm concerned. They're innovations in our institutions, our mental models, the way we think about society. As I said before, what we're built upon was meant for a different time. We live in a very different world, and so our models are failing us. But the way we think about things undermines our ability to move towards models that work for the current world. We have an inequality in the US as high as it's ever been, and it's not addressed. So to your point, the current trajectory doesn't solve that problem. It makes it more acute because automation will just make it worse. So if we don't innovate at the institutional level, I worry, and many economists are worried about the period between now and 2030, because unfortunately we're seeing the kind of societal unrest we're seeing on the news today. I think that's nothing compared to what could happen if we don't solve these challenges. I unfortunately don't see a science and technology solution to this unless you do.
No, I mean, I don't either, and it's depressing. But then again, do you think of societal and institutional impacts or innovations that? I mean, I think you mostly focus on technology and science innovation, but you've obviously given probably a lot more thought than I have to the societal innovations.
Yes.
What should we do?
So we have to rethink the social contracts that are in place today. But that's an example of where mental models get in our way, right? If we continue to think about our current social contracts as entitlements, as welfare states, and this has nothing to do with politics, right? It's really how we think. If those mental models win out, then like universal basic incomes that have been talked about are frowned upon, because that's just another form of welfare, where when they're thinking about this, they're thinking about it as a mechanism to solve the problem that's ahead of us. So if we don't step back and say, rethinking these models for the world that's emerging in a way that doesn't kind of think about the past, I don't see how you solve it. So yes, I thought about it. There's some great ideas that really get pushed back because it doesn't align with the way we think today. And that's a generic problem. And unfortunately, these problems are global. So I also think a global response is required. And unfortunately, we don't do anything very well globally these days. So I'm not a pessimist, by the way. I really do think that if you look at the trajectory, that wheel I showed, there's just so much good that can happen for society if we enable the constructive side of this path. But we have to be willing to innovate at the other levels as well, or we're just going to crash into a mountain before we get there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Chris. Next up, Leona Thomas has a question. Leona, turn it over to you. Hi, Leona. Go ahead.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So sorry, it looked like I was muted for a second. So I guess I noticed on one of the first slides you talked about the empowerment economy, and I guess I wanted to understand a little bit more about what that is and how who's working in it and what do you see sort of coming out of it in the future. And it may be building on some of what Chris was saying but how can we really start to drive things differently, especially since there was already a push to push so many people into gig economy or sort of smaller. I mean, the growth in this company is not going to come out of the big companies. The growth in this company has been coming and is going to continue to come out of the companies that are being started at the ground level. So just wanted to understand what that was and get more detail on it, and if I sort of interpreted what you meant by it, or if I completely missed the boat, just on a two-word description.
Well, it's a broad category that covers some of what you just mentioned, but it also covers truly empowering individuals to have a voice. There's also a Democracy 2.0, I believe, on that visual. They all kind of speak to the same thing, moving towards a place where democracy as it was intended is real, because we can all have a voice. The technologies enable it today, if you allow it, right? So we can as individuals vote on the policies that governments install, because we can enable that to happen. And so the representative government that we have today is replaced by an empowered society that really starts to drive how we do things going forward. So again, it could be a pipe dream, but that's one of the umbrella empowerment's an umbrella topic. That's one of the examples, as is the gig phenomenon that you mentioned. We all are empowered to do things that we like, but also, if automation does occur, then you're starting to move towards an empowerment at a different scale, where we're empowered to focus on our passions, as opposed to having to focus on sustaining ourselves through work. And that brings up all kinds of other questions around whether society is built for that. Can we really just focus on passions without something to keep us busy all day long? The society unwind as a result of that. And I, again, don't have an answer, but these are all great questions to be asking about. And that's why I think those scenarios are really impactful. As you start to unravel those scenarios and think about them, there's so much there to think about. And the fact is that first curve is enabling these things. We just have to have the will to make them real at the constructive level.
Fantastic. Thanks, Frank. Thank you so much, Leona. Next up is Ravi Kurumeti. Ravi, you had a question? Go ahead, Ravi. Can you hear us, Ravi? Well, what I'll do is I'm sorry, Maureen. I can read Ravi's question then, if that's okay. So Ravi had asked, your second to last slide was about attributes that lead to success. Could you please show that again?
Sure, hold on. Let me just get to the sharing piece of this. Okay, hold on. Can you see it, or do I have to?
No, we can see it.
You can see it, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you think about these scenarios, the pace that the world's moving on, and then think about the number of times a company or an organization has to shift. If you can't shift, then the question becomes, how long are you viable? And then there's a lot more to these things, right? Relationship-based, for example, in this world of ecosystems that is emerging, where most value creation and capture is based on multi-stakeholder relationships. How we collaborate, how we are with relationships becomes very, very critical. So there's a reason for each of these, if we think about the world that's being formed. But easy to visualize, hard to accomplish.
First off, Frank, we cannot thank you enough for joining us this evening. Thank you for an extremely compelling topic.